Welcome to L&D Disrupt, the podcast dedicated to helping you overcome workplace challenges and prepare for the future of work today. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be speaking with the movers, shakers, and path breakers in L&D who are reshaping their organizations right now. Join us each week as we delve into the highs and lows of work in the industry to get to the real nitty-gritty stuff that you actually care about.
And I'm pleased to say this week I'm joined by Bonita Matthee, as she just mentioned there, Learning and Development Lead at Permutive, and Ulrika Hofman, who just mentioned also People Partner at Scrive. Thank you both for joining me. I want to start with quite an interesting topic. When we first spoke about this, Bonita, you mentioned something I hadn't considered before, and that is that not every company is necessarily in a position to provide a dedicated spend when it comes to a budget, but actually that means budget is a more holistic thing. It's a much wider thing. It's how we free up resources for people, how we create more time for them, how we create an offering that isn't always based on finance. So I would love to hear your thoughts to sort of kick us off on that issue.
No problem. Yes. And I think also it's a great representation of the times is that not every business has this pocket full of funding in order to invest in every individual, but they are very dedicated investing in them in other ways. So as a business that possibly doesn't have that pocket of funding, it's important to realize what are your other assets. And for many people, they have great experience in the business that could be subject matter experts that can actually be upskilled to run internal sessions where you can create these calendars of internal upskilling so that you remove your linchpins or your single points of failure on certain topics and subjects. And that way people are still being developed within a certain skill set. One thing that I also would recommend is there is actually quite a lot of external resource and funding available to businesses. And although it does take a little bit of time to navigate and get through the paperwork of being able to utilize it, there is a lot that can be done that can save internal money and then focus on that development. But ultimately, it's ensuring that what you are looking for meets both the individual career progression and will help the company to achieve those goals that they're looking for in the long term. So I think it's about being creative. It's about being creative of people internally and the skills that they have. Often we ask all these great questions in an interview to identify what they can do and what they can do really well. And then we just get them to do the job that they've now been employed for without leveraging off of those transferable skills and making that environment of continuous learning as a practice instead of a resource that you've got to now throw money at and do e-learnings and everything else. And that can actually harbor a much better culture of learning, and it'll empower a lot of people. And that balance with apprenticeships or using government funding can actually create a strong foundation for when you do come to a point to pitch to the exec teams about, actually, this is why we could do with some of the funding. Here's our evidence to demonstrate the impact that just these internal resources and funding have had. And then you've got a case to put forward about if we had this additional pot of money, these are some of the other things that we could achieve.
Yeah, I think it's that building proof of impact, isn't it? For if I could do this without any budget, imagine what we could do with this. And it creates that aspirational vision, especially once you've pitched to people why there's value in it. I think a good example is Google. I think it's called Google to Googler to Googler. Mm-hmm. And they essentially, a vast majority of the learning they're doing internally is coming from people with expertise, building these courses, and then sort of giving that knowledge to other people. And all Google really does is just free up the time and create the culture where people are able to do this. So I really like that idea that start with what your current resources are and leverage who you have internally. Ulrika, did you have any thoughts on what Bonita just shared there?
No, I totally agree. And I think it's really, I think we all know probably on this call, the 70-20-10 approach. And that, the biggest learning still takes place at work. So I think there's a lot of things we can do as L&D professionals to support in more that part of the training and learning experience, which doesn't need to require a learning budget per se. So yeah, it's a really good thing to be able to offer when you can, but there's always other ways to find your way around it anyways. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to know actually in the chat if anyone else has any experience with this. I was trying to think of a personal example earlier, and actually the biggest thing I spent my learning budget on this year was public speaking course. So I go to Toastmasters every couple of weeks, use my learning budget to do that, to get better at public speaking. But before I got to that point, people, like a few colleagues, a few people I know, were kind enough to offer up like half an hour of their time to kind of run mock interviews or mock podcasts, so that you can build that skill in practice. And that didn't cost anything except for those people's time and sort of my time to do it, but also to record it, watch it back, that painful experience when you're first starting out, watching yourself back. But yeah, I'd love to know if anyone in the chat has any similar experiences to share. Moving on slightly, when you do get to that point of having that individual pot of money that you can spend, how do we make sure that it's spent well? I think, following on from what you just said, sometimes when we don't have much budget, we're really frugal with how we spend our resources, if they're money or their time, and make sure they're used really well. But then sometimes when we get given this pot of money, we might then have a sort of knee-jerk reaction to spending it. And I think the example most people will relate to is it's the end of the year for the learning budget. There's 2 weeks left to go, and suddenly your manager's like, is there not a course that you want to go on? Do you want to attend an event? Do you want to buy a book? This kind of real urgency to spend right at the end, as opposed to taking that time to think about what's going to drive impact, what's going to be useful. So I'm curious to hear sort of, maybe Ulrika, if you kick us off, what are your thoughts on how do we make sure our learning budget gets well spent so that we don't lose all that goodwill we built up with our previous example of spending time well?
Yeah, exactly. Since it both costs time and money, we really want to get the return on investment. So, I mean, I can share what we've been doing at Scrive. It's very much, we tied the learning budget to the development plan. And so we really want there to be a discussion between the manager and the employee to really discuss the development areas and how that fits into the bigger picture, the needs at Scrive and all those things. And that it should be tied to any development actions in the development plan. So that's really where we try to focus. So we haven't really maybe experienced that type of like last minute applications for learning budgets. But then the other challenge that we've been doing a lot is training our managers to have those type of conversations, to really help employees understand how they can develop and identify those areas, but also how that can be, how they can leverage the learning budget to do so. So yeah, I think that's where we try to pick it up on that, basically, the development plan. So there is a strategic planning in it. So yeah, it shouldn't have to come last minute.
Yeah. Are there any things that you've tried that you think have worked really well, or principles when it comes to syncing up with the managers, kind of enabling them and tying it to the overall development plan or business goals? Is there anything you've seen work?
Yeah, so we've been trying different things, everything from having a leaders OKR that actually has one of the key results linked to the learning budget and development goals actually as well. So that's one of the things that we're really following up managers on. But also we have like a pulse tool that sends out questions regularly. So we have an L&D pulse that goes out as well, which kind of helps employees to their little reminder of, remember that you have the learning budget. So have you spoken to your manager about how that could be used? So kind of trying from two different angles to remind about the benefit, which it is. So that's things that we've been trying to kind of increase the awareness, because it's so easy to forget.
Yeah, exactly. And I think sometimes, unless you pitch what the real value is well, it can fall by the wayside a little bit, and people just think that, I don't know, that maybe they view it as a token gesture, or they kind of forget the purpose if it's not tied to their overall development plan. So sometimes I think the messaging is right, and having those regular touch points has probably helped massively as well. Bonita, in your view, how is I know you've also got some thoughts on how we enable managers, but overall, what's your kind of take and insights on making sure budgets get spent well so they return on the investment?
Yeah, as long as you are always thinking of somebody's career progression as well and what it means to them individually, until you get that personal buy-in of what's in it for me, it's very difficult to get somebody invested in how they're going to allocate the time to make sure that they can take on that development. So thinking of career progression, but also doing things like skills gap analysis. Although it's a skill we all hear of, it's taking the time to do a skills gap analysis of that future proofing yourself. Where do you want to be in the next couple of years? If we had to work backwards, what could stop you from getting that role? And then going into a development plan that is based on that longevity. But I also think it's about taking it to another level where a manager can then analyze the skills gap as a team. So future-proofing the team to have a certain set of skills and saying, what is it that we need to all be really good at to set our team up for success? And then doing that rankings of where maybe those shortfalls lie within the team. There also needs to be a little bit of flexibility with the budget, is that if we are seeing that an individual isn't necessarily, running to go and buy the book or the course or whatever it is, it's about being creative with it. And what we have seen is some teams saying, let's collectively pool this budget together and identify a way that we can upskill ourselves as a team or create networking events or something that's really going to create that cohesion and that collaboration that in itself is motivation for team to achieve goals and progress. So that's another way to use it. As I think it's just removing the guardrails of it's one budget, one person, you have to use this, but actually looking at ways that you can change it up. And that's something we've seen quite successful. I think it's also just ensuring that there's the why behind it. A lot of people are just, we talk to managers about, are they using the L&D budget? But just getting that personal why for somebody about why it could be important and identifying that personal motivation is probably one of the first steps, because without that, you can have all the budget in the world. And I'm sure we've all heard the saying, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And I like to extend that saying by, have you checked if the horse is thirsty? And that's where it kind of comes in, is that we are throwing all this L&D budget, and you can have this, and you can have LinkedIn Learning, and you can have this time, and you can have this money, and nobody's asked if the horse is thirsty. And I'm not referring to people as horses, but in the saying itself is, until you identify the hunger, what you're putting in front of them won't be consumed.
Yeah. No, I really like that. Yeah. Ulrika, sorry, you're gonna come in there.
No, I totally agree. It's a classic that we just launch different initiatives, but it can really fall flat because it really needs to come from them. They need to own their development and really see the benefit of that. And then they will really prioritize it, make it happen. Budget or not. So that's why it's really important to enable leaders to have these discussions, to really go to that depth and to really understand. Help the employee identify their thirst, because sometimes employees struggle with kind of putting those type of words in their mouth because they're not used to thinking from that perspective as well. So we've definitely experienced a challenge when it comes to that.
Yeah, I think if you add those couple of things together, the North Star for, if your career goal is X, then you need these skills to get there. And we kind of work back from that. And then also if we understand the why, every time we talk about how your learning budget is being spent, or even any piece of learning you do, you can kind of ask pretty clearly, does this help you progress towards that thing? And I think that's the bit that's often missing. It's just, well, here's the money, how are we going to spend it? But actually, it's here's where we want to get, and the money is kind of a tool to get there. So I think that analogy about the thirsty horses, as we'll call it, is 100% true, because without that real clarity about where we need to get to, often that is why money doesn't get spent well. And there's another thing there as well. You mentioned it, Bonita, in passing there, was looking at who spends their budget and on what. I think this is a bit of the equation that gets missed, because we often talk about, especially when it's something like creating content or building advocates for learning, you would look at the people that are creating content or the people that have this good story to tell about learning. And I think often that's part of it, is who is spending their learning budget and why, and to what effect, and who isn't spending their learning budget, and then also why and how can we turn that around? Is this something both of you have seen, the data being quite a useful touch point?
Yeah, we've done a little bit of an analysis recently on our previous year, and we actually created this learning library, which was a resource to other employees to see what others were doing. And ultimately, one of the drivers is just transparency. Is nobody really wants to put their hand up and go, oh, I'm not using mine, what are you using it on? Because they don't want to be seen to not be utilizing a great internal benefit. So we made it accessible for everybody to have a review, and we asked people within the business to write a outputs-based benefit post against it. So what course they attended, the reason why they wanted to do it, and what they got out of it. And there we would put the link, etc., for them to have a look at. And this was great to then encourage people to start cross-collaborating on learning and creating almost cohorts of spend. That there was a couple people, to your point, Gary, that public speaking is something they really wanted to work on. And then there was this trend of actually a few people wanting to do it. And it was almost a safety in numbers that was created, that 5 or 6 people then joined the one training course in order to practice public speaking. And then we would utilize them more in all hands or kickoffs and that to actually get them the opportunity to practice. So I think that transparency piece on what others are doing and sharing the outputs and the values that they've gotten from it is something quite important to create that culture of learning.
Yeah. Yeah, I think actually that's a great point. That I love this idea of the collective learning budget, because often the things we really need to do to build a skill that will future-proof us is quite far outside our comfort zone. So having that safety net of we'll all go and do this together is actually a really interesting idea that I've not heard anyone else mention around learning budgets. And funny enough, actually, when you mentioned public speaking, the amount of times it's like I've been dragged here by my friend because they didn't want to come on their own. And what was actually quite sweet, I went yesterday and a lady brought her 2 kids. They were like 16 and 18, and she brought them, the 3 of them from the same family came together because she wanted her kids to maybe get some exposure to that environment, getting up in front of other people and speaking. So I really love this idea of the sort of collective budget. Ulrika, I've gone off on a tangent, which is my number one bad habit probably, but what are your thoughts as well on how we can maybe look at the data or build stories around how people have used their budget to achieve something and maybe snowball that so other people really get behind it?
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen that sometimes people are struggling to know what to use it for. So I think these type of examples are kind of like content, they can really work like content marketing examples for like, this is what we use it for. Maybe that could be useful for you as well. I think that's a really good way of doing it. But yeah, in terms of data in general, I think it's pretty much, I mean, we're using it to kind of check up on progress and make small nudges along the way and so on. So maybe not any super creative data insights I can share at the moment.
Yeah, that's all right. It means you're doing it in the right way. Learn, iterate slightly, learn, don't rip up the rule book. So that's normally actually a good.
But I think what we try to do is really integrate the learning budget in like more different things that we talk about. So, I mean, that we don't talk about it in an isolated event, but we really integrate it in a lot of things when we have leaders forums, when we do different type of like HR reporting in general, and when we have different types of trainings, we also always pick it up. So there's kind of just, yeah, becomes part of the learning culture, so to say.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, to draw another parallel to marketing, as you just mentioned, marketing there, it would be that before someone becomes a lead or fills in a form on their website, there's typically multiple touch points. So the fact that you're building that into wider conversations, reports that are going out internally, you really are creating that kind of multi-touch point approach to getting people invested in it. I'm going to sound like the learning budget hypocrite now because I've been saying like people should spend it. But I guess part of the balance as well is people, we're not here to just grant requests. We need to maybe push back sometimes and say it's not about kind of always what you want to spend it on, but what's going to be more beneficial to you. So we're saying like you should spend your learning budget. No, not on that. But that's the worry I have about the hypocrisy part. But yeah, I would love to know your thoughts on how do we get that balance and that sort of the right tone in conversations where we're saying, is that actually beneficial to you or is it kind of more a nice to do?
Yeah, I definitely think that that's where the leader comes in and has a really important role to play to really ensure that the development needs are targeted and that they have identified it, that it's aligned to that, and challenge anything that is kind of outside of that. Is this really adding value? Is this relevant? So yeah, the leader is essential there for sure to challenge.
Yeah, Bonita, would you see it the same way, or is there sort of is there anything else you would come at it from?
I think your point is correct that it does come down to the manager and how effective their conversations are. But there are cases that maybe the conversations aren't as good as we hope they would be. So there might be this knee-jerk effect that happens of, oh, well, this looks fun, so I'm just going to do it. And yeah, I'm quite accustomed to the reject button on the learning platform. And I get a very quick response from people going, why did you reject it? And then I think it's because we haven't really identified the true why. And somebody's seen it because it looks great or it's trending or something along those lines. And I think that's when you have to have that deeper conversation of tell me more about why this is important to you and how you're going to translate this into your day-to-day work. And as a business, we have to be mindful that, yes, we are spending money and there has to be a measurement of ROI within that investment. How do we demonstrate it? And often it's about then setting up projects alongside that course itself and then seeing if it's a stretch zone for them. If maybe we've missed that their career progression maybe isn't in that field that they're currently in, and we can then open up the opportunities to job shadowing and looking at how that career course might take a bit of a left turn. So yes, sometimes there are that balance of this isn't really important now, and you can shift a little bit of that. But I think it's just being open and really having those deeper coaching conversations of getting that root cause and how are you going to make yourself accountable for this learning and how are you going to demonstrate the reward to you on the short term and the long term, and then of course, advocate for it in the business.
It's kind of the wider L&D problem a lot of teams face in a microcosm, because often people come to you and say, we need sales training for X. And the reason that's happening is because problem discovery hasn't happened to the full extent where we've gone, actually, what's the thing that's holding your sales team back? Actually, it's this. Okay, working back from there. So I guess it's the same with our learning budgets discussion. It's if we've discovered that why and that North Star for career growth, then this will happen a lot less actually. So it's about the pyramid of the foundations are, where is this person aiming to go and what skills do they need to get there? And we'll kind of scale it up as we go. You mentioned it there as well, building this sort of ROI focus into the system, or maybe the mindset shift towards outcomes when we're getting people to submit learning requests. So I know there'll be a lot of people interested in the sort of processes you've set up to capture learning requests, to approve them, because I guess it's more balanced here again, isn't it? We want to give them enough structure to make a really good case for why this learning budget needs to be spent in this way, but we also don't want it to be like you have to write out War and Peace just to get someone to approve something. So I guess it's structure without red tape and how we get that balance right. But Ulrika, maybe you want to kick us off and just tell us how you've gone through that process of setting the guardrails without making it kind of a cumbersome process.
How we've established the process is really that it should be obviously before the use of the learning budget. So that's another challenge because not everyone does it in that order. But it really starts with a conversation with their manager. So we want the employee to take kind of the front seat when it comes to their development, to come with a proposal, propose that to the manager and have a discussion around that, linking back to the development plan. And then from there, it's basically just a approve or deny from the manager's perspective, if it's an easy case, basically. And then, go ahead to do the learning experience. Then what is really nice, but that's maybe not something we can ask of everyone, depending on the personality and all those type of things. But it's a really nice return on investment to really get some type of sharing afterwards. So that's something we've been doing in our team, for example, when we've been doing trainings and using the learning budget for that we have sessions afterwards where we actually share what we've learned so that other people get to kind of benefit from it as well. And also just those type of discussions to get the social learning in it as well. But that's nothing we expect. It's not like anything mandatory for everyone, but we really see that's a really great benefit as well.
Yeah, we used to do that in one of our old companies, actually. If you went to an event, like not everyone from the team would go to an event because it wouldn't make sense. So if you went, you would come back and report back maybe like the 3 big things you took away from that to the rest of the team the following week. That is a great way to cement it in your own mind. I always say that, like, especially even something like this, afterwards, writing the summary of the episode, it kind of cements the key points in my brain. And I think maybe that also happens when people report back what they've learned. Bonita, from your end, when you're setting up that process for how people submit their requests, are you giving them that structure in terms of prompts? Are there minimum requirements to submit a request, or generally speaking, how do you tailor that process?
I think it begins with the transparency and the information. And we have to, I live by this saying, and anyone who works with me knows I say this far too often, is that you have to educate before you execute. And it's about ensuring that the people in the business are well educated on the process of it, what it means for them, why the business has this in place, and almost do that self-assessment, those self-coaching questions to identify the reason why they want to take the course. But it's also about making it as easy as possible. Before I joined Permutive, we noticed that there wasn't a very big uptake on it because the process was just hassle. It was a lot of admin for people to have to go through this way and submit that and wait for this and maybe pay for it themselves and claim it back. And that, for any experience, whether we're doing it from our shopping experience and we determine where we buy because of that user-friendly result, that was happening internally. And we looked at ways of making this as easy as possible so that, yes, it becomes a conversation with the managers. They will then submit their request through the platform. Gary and his team are very used to me sending some potential upgrades on the system just to make it as easy as possible. And then it's just a case of they submit the request, it comes through, and to the point of Ulrika there about getting it approved by the manager. And then it's just ensuring that we are getting those responses and getting it through to them as soon as possible, but also then triggering a follow-up of how they're finding the learning, would they rate it to others, and then sharing that response as well. So it's then empowering others to take that initiative because of how easy it can be.
Yeah. Turning that around, that process of here's a load of friction to do it versus look how easy it is now. Have you seen that change the sentiment around how people view the process of using their learning budget internally? Because I guess if it took you ages and it still got rejected, that's the ultimate worst case scenario. And you go, oh, wow, I'm not going to do that again. But if it took you no time at all, and because of the structure, it got approved and you got a benefit from it, then you're more likely to say, oh, that was great. I'd love to do that again. I'll make sure I enjoy the process and submit more requests for my learning budget.
Yeah, it's a balance of both, really, because if you do make it seamless, they're more bought into the experience, the learner experience that we have to look at. But also, I think it's really valuable if people understand the time that the L&D team or somebody in HR is willing to spend to go into a little bit more detail about the reason it might have been rejected, or actually, let's just go into a deep dive. And often people will, at the end of that, feel more motivated to then take the step to put in the next request because they have that internal fire that's like, right now I'm excited. Now I really want to do this because I understand that what's in it for me, what's in it for the business. And that will then shift actually the ROI because the initiative will be much better received and they will understand exactly why we've taken that time. It's not just a reject, sorry, next request. It's that real personable approach to the conversation.
I guess, Ulrika, to follow up on that, how has perception changed in your eyes? You know, you've given people more touch points and more aware of it. You've talked about tapping into those stories about how people have done well. Have you kind of seen a shift in perception, and how useful has that been in terms of buy-in?
I would say it's definitely it's been a process for sure. We launched the learning budget very recently. It was just 1.5 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, and so we didn't have like a prior process that was cumbersome in any way. So I mean, it's been in how now from the start. I would say that the challenge is really more, what we see is to get people to really see the value and use it. So we're focusing much more on the education piece than anything else when it comes to that. So both managers and employees and what we've also heard is kind of more of a stopper is that they don't feel that they have the time. So that we're trying to address learning and development more from a strategic point of view and from a leadership point of view, than more functionality wise or that part, because that's kind of where we see that people are struggling. So we don't really have cases where people are maybe not using it for the right things. We just want it to increase because we know that will be beneficial if they use it for good things. Yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question there.
No, I think it's like incremental, isn't it? You don't go from 0 to 100. So it's maybe about setting those milestones. And actually, that's probably a good takeaway for people today. It won't be from going from this naught of having nothing in place to this seamless process where it's all driving impact. I think everything we spoke about today.
Yeah, it's definitely not. Yeah, it's definitely not perfect from day one. And I think we work a lot like continuous improvement. So when we see, and we in that way we work very data driven. So we have a CEO. Okay, so actually this was the percentage used last year, and we share that with leaders, and we discuss that during leaders forum. Why is this so low? How can we increase this? What are the challenges? What are the barriers? So we're really trying to have an open dialogue and to identify the roadblocks to kind of work forward when it comes to that. So yeah, for us it's more dialogue and data to follow up on that, and hopefully we will see like a continuous increase for everything we do. But yeah, we want to do the right things instead of doing too many things at the same time, and blow up.
No, exactly. One thing I wanted to follow up on that you mentioned earlier, which I've slipped my mind until now, is this relationship building with managers. I know you mentioned a few times that like a lot of the touch points are managers, and you're really enabling both the learners and the managers. But how much has this helped having that strong relationship with managers? Is there any tips you'd give people for really understanding what managers and their teams need to succeed, and then enabling them with that focus in mind?
Yeah, we try to address it on many different angles. So everything from general forums where all leaders join, and we have also workshops where we dig deeper into these topics. So that's more like an open forum. But then we have more one-to-ones where me as a people partner follow up with every manager and have these things on my agenda to kind of address, okay, so based on what we talked about in the forum, for example, what are you experiencing, and kind of make it more specific to their needs in that forum. And then other formats and channels as well. But we really try to address it in many different areas so they can't miss it. we bother them on that.
Yeah. Bonita, before we move on as well, just curious if you had any further thoughts on relationship building and that impact on the learning budget, and also you're not just managers, but other people you might build relationships with in the process.
Yeah, one of the blockers is probably we'd said about people making time for their learning and development, and something that happened in one of our kickoffs when I think I did one of my first presentations about L&D and the budget, was the CEO then stood up and said, I dedicate 2 hours a week to my personal development. And this almost became a permission, right? An aspiration that if the CEO of this company is making the time for their personal development, then so should I. And I think it's really important that people within the exec and the C-suite are actually sharing their own learnings and being transparent possibly about some shortfalls that they might have in their own developmental skills gap and what they are doing to fill that need. And that in itself creates this, conversation builder. Somebody might go and have that extended conversation with someone in the exec or the C-suite who might have felt they couldn't really approach. And I'm not saying that that's normally our culture as an organization, but I think a lot of people can be quite apprehensive of it. So when that happened, it was that light bulb for a lot of people that actually it is about how dedicated you are to making the time. And if it's a priority for you and a priority for the business, then it should all work out. And that seemed to create this little bit of a cascade. And when we actually launched our internal leadership program, it was about how much they were valued for that time when they were blocked off for days or weeks. Our program is quite intense. It's about 6 months long. And it was just the respect for that person's development. And I think that's something that we have to ensure happens, is that, yes, we have to see what others are doing, but there's also the respect of people's time, is that if it is blocked out in a calendar, that it needs to be seen as a priority, right? That somebody is actually dedicating that time, and that becomes your conversation as a manager that, I saw that you spent 2 hours on Friday on a particular course. Tell me what stood out to you. Who else in the business do you think could benefit from this? What would your review on it be? And that then respects that learning culture. Is often when it's put in, it's like, oh, no, just can you move that out? And that can hinder people's thought process of realizing how valuable their personal development is to the company.
Yeah. it becomes that thing where, well, this person blocked out this time. Actually, this is more pressing. So it just keeps getting shunted further down the order. Another byproduct of that, actually, when you spoke about managers sharing how they're developing, being invested in their development, kind of ran parallel to another thought in my mind, which is we've spoken about the danger of tying learning new skills and progressing to just getting into a new role. And sometimes people see that if your manager isn't saying how they're learning and what they're doing to progress, it might create that self-fulfilling prophecy even more. I learned this, I progressed to become a manager, and then that's kind of my end point. But I guess it would be two things happening. The manager needs to communicate, this is what I'm doing to improve, because we never stop improving and our culture is about learning. And also, these are my new North Stars, right? I progressed into this role, but that doesn't mean I can't progress in terms of new skills or next part of my career. So I guess, that's, I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on my ramblings about managers being invested in their development as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just as the Bonita said before, like the importance of the C-level doing this and being transparent of how they invest their time. So are leaders. I mean, it really starts with them. They can make a huge difference. It's kind of the symbolic part that I really invest in it because I know that it helps me grow, and I'm definitely not done. So kind of sets the culture. So totally agree.
Yeah, there's also a level of actually separating the two, is that we need to identify career progression and promotion and leveling and how someone's title is affected as two different things. And if somebody is only motivated to do something because it's going to result in a promotion or a different change in level or status, we have to kind of identify that there needs to be a level of both. Skills expire. And I think this is something that we don't necessarily talk about, is what you were really good at a few years ago, the way that the market's changed, the customers have changed, the platforms have changed, culture, all of those things. How are you remaining relevant? And that career progression is that you are better at something tomorrow than you are today, that you are better at it at 6 months, and that you can measure that impact on how much more time you have to be strategic over tactical. And it's separating the two. And when you do come to the point of having a promotion or an opportunity opens up, you have an evidence-based promotion. And you can then present and go, actually, these were some of the things I needed to work on. This was the gaps I identified, the time I invested. And then it makes it easier, because a lot of companies fall short by promoting, then doing skills gap and realizing, oh, actually, there's a few things I can't do, then training. And then that time to competency in their new role is hindered because we haven't set them up for the right success. And by reversing that model and saying, where do you want to be in a year's time? What skills do you need to order to hit that ground running, and building it up that way, it just sets people up for that motivation and that success. And if they then maybe look for jobs outside of an organization because maybe it's small, or, everyone has their ceiling in businesses, that actually that company has invested in somebody's career and not just what it means to them as a full ROI.
Evidence-based
totally.
Yeah. I was going to say evidence-based progression is such a good way to put it, because if the progression is tied to evidence, that means there has to be some sort of impact. And how do we drive impact and growth? It's through finding that North Star for learning and following the right relevant L&D strategy to get you from point A to point B. It's a byproduct of the growth and the learning, as opposed to you learn this to get to that point, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's definitely what we have been experiencing as well, that we really need to help people not be focused on a promotion for a title sake or for salary sake, but that's really linked to skills and what do you need to do, what looks different when you are on that next level. So what we've been doing is building career paths that clearly define the different levels and what you are expected to know and how you're expected to perform, because that helps leaders have those type of dialogues instead of, I just want a senior title. Okay, but what does senior mean? What do you do differently? So this is a huge thing, and it really helps the employee when they understand that, okay, growth is not about having a senior title or being a manager, because it's commonly misunderstood and mixed up completely. It's more the skills.
Yeah, exactly. And I agree with someone you mentioned before, just a moment ago, Bonita, as well. It's like the industry is changing so quickly that motivation is there. Like, personally speaking, I'm seeing it with things like SEO, that the ground rules are changing so much, so often, that there's a real stimulus and motivation there. And I don't know if we can necessarily formalize spend around things like that, because if they're changing very quickly, there might not be some sort of dedicated course. So it might even be that blocking off time again to allow people to grow. But yeah, I certainly think that can be a big part of the conversation.
Yeah. What I would also say is that although cultures and all these type of things have changed, L&D has changed. And I think it's time that businesses actually realized how much of a resource L&D is. And it isn't just somebody who manages your LMS or your LXP and books a couple of courses and manages budget. It's actually about how it creates this retention and this upskilling and how effective people are, their time to competencies, and actually being that internal coach for people's progression, and just creating quite a large element of that, like psychological safety, to ensure that people can put their hand up and go, I'm not good at this, and I need some help, and I really want to be good at this. So what are my options? And that in itself, I think, is something that's probably changed in the industry, that is something that's becoming a bit more recognized now. And you'll notice that in the trend of L&D jobs and the postings that go up, because I think they're seeing that in order to have great retention and great culture and people who are progressing and actually being more successful within new roles and their longevity in the business is based on a lot of these foundations that we've talked about today.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Before we transition, retention is a nice segue into the role of learning budgets on employer brands. But just to remind anyone, if you've got any questions from what we spoke about in the last 45 minutes or so, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll get to them after this point. I think this is part of the equation, isn't it? It's learning budgets. You often see them in job descriptions. You mentioned job descriptions there, but you'll often see that as one of the benefits at the forefront: investment in your development, a dedicated spend of X for each person. So even if it's just a shorthand way of signifying to people before you hire them that we will invest in your growth, I do think that to some extent, having a learning budget for people does influence how you attract talent. So I'd be curious to know, from an employer brand perspective, how do you think having that learning budget and that culture influences your ability to hire?
Yeah, I mean, it is a benefit. So it's definitely very attractive, and it's worth talking about from an employer branding perspective. And I would say that learning and development in general is one of the most important things that people are looking for when they are either evaluating to stay with a company or actually moving over to another company. So yeah, I think this is really important to share that. If we have it, we should definitely market it. And if we don't have a learning budget, we can promote learning hours, for example. We allow every employee to invest X hours per week, for example. So I definitely think that it's a strength.
Yeah, I was going to build up on that and just say that not many organizations, I think, with the amount of restructures and redundancies we're seeing, a lot of companies are becoming quite maybe frugal and a bit more conscious of their spend. So we wouldn't want to inhibit people who could be great, culture warriors or great addition to the team, because that budget might not be in place. But I think it's important to Ulrika's point there is actually advocate what that still means, is having a dedicated learning coach to identify progression and skills gaps and internal learning culture. Those type of things can also be incredibly valuable to ensure that it's lived by. And if you've got case studies, it's also great to highlight that. A lot of people use case studies in marketing and sales, but actually don't use case studies of learning and development as much. And this could be a great way to highlight the impact of what can be done in a business or how else we can support without just a pocket of funding.
Yeah, I was thinking that myself. Often we talked about the why, but if people see, I'm applying for a job, there's this amount of spend per person, how is that typically being spent would be something that would enter my thought process. And if you can support that with some data, like 90% of people spent 90% of their budget, or 75% of people said having that learning budget allowed them to learn a new skill that made them perform better in their job, or any real metrics that there's been an uptick in X team, or like any of those little stories that say we've got it, but this is how it's spent and this is how it benefits people. And if you can bring in a human story to that, even better. Before you head off, I want to tell you about two very exciting things. Death of the LMS, your free guide to skills first L&D, is now live. From the numbers that explain L&D's current problems to lessons on how you can build a skills-led strategy, this is going to help you drive more impact through learning. You'll find the link right at the top of this episode's description. And just below that, a link to our new weekly walkthrough, where we show you how this can be done in practice and give you a tour of how now. Our learning experience platform that gets 5 times more engagement than a traditional LMS. So, thanks for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again for another episode of the podcast.